July 13, 2008. A small American outpost in the mountains of Afghanistan came under attack. 48 soldiers against more than 200 Taliban fighters. When the gunfire stopped, 9 Americans were dead and nearly everyone else was wounded. But one man, bleeding, alone, surrounded, kept fighting. He wasn't a medic. He wasn't supposed to survive. Yet for hours he held the line, calling in airstrikes and saving the lives of the men who could still hear his voice over the radio. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Ryan Pitts, the lone survivor on the hill, the soldier who refused to die, and the battle that showed what courage truly means. Chapter 1: The Outpost in the Mountains. In the summer of 2008, a small group of American soldiers built an outpost in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. It was called Observation Post Topside, just outside a village named Wanat in the Kunar province, a place so remote it barely existed on maps. Their mission was simple on paper: establish security, win local trust, and hold the high ground. But in Afghanistan, nothing is simple. The valley around Wanat was Taliban country: steep ridges, thick trees, and narrow passes that turned every path into a death trap. The villagers watched, the mountains listened, and the silence before dawn always meant something was coming. Among the soldiers stationed there was Staff Sergeant Ryan M. Pitts, 22 years old, from New Hampshire. He was a medic by title. He was a forward observer, responsible for calling in artillery and air support. But when the time came, he would become so much more. He had been in Afghanistan before. He knew the terrain, the rhythm of life, the way the wind changed right before an ambush. He also knew the cost. He had already lost friends in the valleys below. But he didn't complain. He kept his humor, his discipline, and his focus. By early July, the men at Wanat were exhausted. They'd been building defensive positions for days under the blazing Afghan sun, short on food, water, and sleep. Still, morale was high. They believed they could hold the outpost until reinforcements arrived. On the night of July 12th, Ryan was assigned to the northern perimeter, a small cluster of sandbags and bunkers that offered a view of the valley. He checked his radio, cleaned his rifle, and tried to rest. It was quiet, too quiet. At 4:20 a.m., everything changed. A thunderstorm of gunfire erupted from the ridgelines. More than 200 Taliban fighters opened fire on just 48 Americans. The first wave hit like a hammer. Grenades rained down. Bullets shredded the sandbags. Communication lines went dead. Ryan was thrown to the ground by the blast of a grenade. Shrapnel tore into both his legs and arms. He was bleeding heavily, barely able to move. The observation post around him was collapsing, soldiers screaming, firing, falling. But even through the pain, he grabbed his radio. His voice, broken and shaking, came over the net. "We retaken fire. They re-inside the wire. We need everything you've got." He was alone, wounded, surrounded, and the fight for Wanat had just begun. Chapter 2: The Battle Begins. The first attack came before dawn, a blur of sound, smoke, and fire. From every ridge and every shadow, gunmen opened up on Observation Post Topside. The Taliban had surrounded them during the night. RPGs screamed through the air. Mortar rounds exploded inside the perimeter. Machine gun fire ripped across the sandbags like rain. In seconds, the outpost was on fire. Staff Sergeant Ryan Pitts was already bleeding. A grenade had detonated near him, filling both his legs with shrapnel. He could barely stand, his rifle slick with blood. But he crawled to the edge of the bunker, grabbed a hand grenade, and began to fight back. He tossed grenades over the wall until his arms went numb. Each explosion lit up the mountains for a heartbeat enough for him to spot enemy movement. When his ammo ran out, he dragged himself across the dirt to a fallen comrade's weapon. He reloaded and kept firing. The radio crackled with chaos. "We're overrun. They're in the wire. We need air support now." Ryan took the handset, his voice low but steady. "I am still here. I can see them. Bring it on me if you have to." He knew what that meant. He was calling artillery and airstrikes dangerously close to his own position. He didn't care. If it saved his brothers at the base below, it was worth it. As the minutes dragged on, Ryan realized he was the only one left alive at topside. Every man around him had been killed or wounded. He was alone, one soldier holding a hill against hundreds. He could hear them coming now, footsteps crunching, foreign voices shouting orders, the metallic clicks of reloading rifles. He threw more grenades, fired his last magazine, and then crawled to cover behind the ruined wall. His vision blurred, his arms shook, but he refused to quit. When the supporting platoon finally reached the hill, they found Ryan barely conscious, surrounded by the bodies of his friends and a ring of empty casings. He had called in over 80 artillery rounds, all while bleeding out, refusing evacuation until the enemy was pushed back. For hours, he had been the last line between life and death, and somehow he was still alive. Chapter 3. Alone on the Hill. The world had shrunk to the size of a few meters of dirt. Ryan Pitts lay behind a wall of shattered sandbags, bleeding into the dust. Every breath burned, every sound felt distant, until the gunfire came again, snapping him back to reality. He was alone. Everyone around him was gone. 9 soldiers, his friends, brothers, teammates, had been killed in minutes, and yet the fight wasn't over. Ryan checked his legs. Shrapnel had torn through both thighs. He couldn't stand, but he could still move his arms. He reloaded his rifle, pulled a grenade close, and waited. Taliban fighters were closing in, their voices echoing through the smoke. Ryan threw a grenade, waited for the explosion, then threw another. Each blast bought him seconds, just enough time to switch weapons and reload. He was running out of everything: ammunition, grenades, strength. He thought of his family back home, his mother, his friends, his fiancée. He didn't think about dying. He thought about holding on. Between bursts of fire, he spoke into his radio, voice breaking with exhaustion. "They're all gone up here. I am still fighting." The reply came from the valley below, soldiers trying to reach him. "Hang on, Pitts. We're comin'." He knew they were trying, but the slope was steep and covered by enemy fire. He could hear the bullets whizzing past, the ricochets striking metal. He refused to let the enemy take that hill. He wouldn't let them take the bodies of his brothers. A helicopter roared overhead, dropping flares. The blasts lit up the valley, casting long shadows over the outpost. Ryan crawled forward again, dragging himself by his elbows, using what little strength he had left to pull a radio wire back into position. He needed to guide the air support. When the first strike hit, the mountain shook. Dust rained down. He could hear the enemy pulling back. For the first time in hours, the gunfire slowed. Ryan lay still, his body shaking uncontrollably. He whispered to himself, barely conscious, "Just stay awake. Just one more minute." And then silence. Only the wind and the faint hum of the radio. He had done it. He had held the hill alone. Chapter 4. The Aftermath. When reinforcements finally reached observation post topside, the battle had already been raging for nearly 4 hours. Smoke hung low over the mountain. The smell of gunpowder and burning canvas filled the air. The hill looked like a graveyard. They found Staff Sergeant Ryan Pitts lying behind a mound of sandbags, barely conscious, his uniform soaked in blood. Empty magazines surrounded him. The radio handset was still in his hand. "Pitts, you were alive," one soldier said, kneeling beside him. Ryan opened his eyes, voice barely a whisper. "They were all gone. I couldn't have saved them." Medics tried to stabilize him. Shrapnel had torn through both legs, his right arm, and his back. He had lost nearly half his blood. As they carried him down the hill, enemy fire still cracked in the distance, but for Ryan, the world had gone silent. He was evacuated to Bagram Airfield, then to Germany, and finally home to the United States. Doctors called his survival a miracle. He called it something else, a burden. In the hospital, he asked about his unit before asking about himself. When he learned who hadn't made it, he broke down completely. 9 names, 9 brothers. Men he had eaten with, laughed with, fought beside, all gone. He kept saying, "Why them, not me?" Ryan spent months in recovery, physically healing, but mentally replaying the battle again and again. The sounds, the screams, the explosions, they never left. He had survived, but part of him was still on that hill in Wanat. When he finally returned to New Hampshire, the welcome was overwhelming: banners, neighbors, TV crews calling him a hero. But Ryan didn't feel like one. He said quietly to a reporter, "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home." It took years before he could tell the story publicly, and when he did, he didn't talk about glory. He talked about friendship, duty, and the promise they all made to never leave anyone behind. He had kept that promise even when it meant being the last man standing. Chapter 5. The Medal of Honor. On July 21, 2014, 6 years after the Battle of Wanat, Staff Sergeant Ryan M. Pitts stood inside the White House in full dress uniform. He looked calm, but his eyes carried the weight of the hill he never left behind. Before him stood President Barack Obama. Around him sat families, the parents, wives, and children of the 9 men who had died that morning in Afghanistan. Their names were engraved on his heart long before they were etched in stone. The citation was read aloud. For extraordinary heroism and selfless acts of valor, while under heavy enemy fire, Staff Sergeant Ryan M. Pitts distinguished himself by acts of gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. The President placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The audience rose to their feet. Applause filled the room, but Ryan didn't smile. He looked down, hands trembling slightly. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was steady but heavy. "I am honored, but this medal belongs to them. To the 9 men who fought beside me and never made it home. I wear it for them, not for me." He listed each name aloud one by one, his brothers from 2nd Platoon, Chosen Company, 173rd Airborne Brigade. By the time he finished, the room was silent again. Even the President looked down. After the ceremony, reporters tried to ask him about heroism. He answered simply, "Valor isn't about surviving. It's about standing your ground when everything in you wants to run." In the years since, Ryan Pitts has used his voice not to glorify war, but to remind the country of its cost. He speaks to young soldiers, veterans, and students about what it means to serve and about the invisible wounds that follow you home. He often says he didn't win anything at Wanat. He endured it. And he carries that endurance with him still in the quiet moments, in the memories, and in the empty chairs that never leave his mind. Because for Ryan, the medal isn't about recognition, it's about remembrance, and the promise that he'll keep telling their story until his last breath. Epilogue never came home. He lived, but a part of him never left that hill. Staff Sergeant Ryan Pitts carried home the weight of 9 lives and the echo of a battle that never truly ended. He walks, he speaks, he laughs, but behind every word, there's a silence only soldiers understand. He didn't die in Wanat, but something inside him stayed there guarding that outpost, holding the line, keeping a promise no medal could ever repay. Today, he says he is not a hero. He's a witness, and his mission now is to make sure the world remembers those who didn't make it back. Because courage isn't always about dying for something, sometimes it's about living with it. He never forgot their names. He never left their side. And though his brothers never came home, he carries them every day, in every breath, in the silence between heartbeats.